I have no clue what I exactly did to do it, but hopefully we're gonna figure that out right now. There it is, boys! Mother... Look at this!
Whether you love or hate Kamilia 3, there's no denying that the speedrunning scene has been immensely popular and competitive. But almost every time I see someone speedrun the game, I see someone asking the same question. How does the Emperor 1 skip work? And nobody ever seems to know the answer. So to save me from writing out huge explanations over and over in people's Twitch chats, here is a needlessly in-depth explanation of the Emperor 1 skip. For anyone not familiar with Kamilia 3, Emperor 1 skip is a trick which allows us to skip this entire platforming screen, the first screen taken from the game I Want to Be the Emperor, hence the name Emperor 1 skip. Normally after exiting Maze 2 you'd start Emperor 1 down here, but by doing a certain set of inputs while the room is loading, you can teleport yourself right up here to the end. I will explain how to do this trick, but the focus of this video is going to be more on why it works rather than how to do it. So let's take a look. The root of the problem is a combination of two things. Some unexpected behavior from GameMaker's solid collision engine in a very particular set of circumstances, and Kamilia's lethargy in making a lazy attempt to patch some behavior that he didn't really understand why it was happening. So let's examine those things. There's also an important detail to be learned by looking at the layouts of the two rooms. Here is the Maze 2 layout, including the exit warp in the top right, which is usually off screen. And here is the same view of the Emperor 1 screen. Notice the exit warp for both of these screens is in the exact same position with the same hitbox. Okay, let's come back to this in a moment. Let's talk about collisions and solids. Every frame, the kid's X and Y coordinate are updating based on what arrow keys the player is currently holding and the kid's natural gravity. So just for example, if the player is currently holding the right arrow key on a particular frame, this will cause the kid's X coordinate to increase by 3. Immediately after the X and Y update happens, the engine will check for collisions between the kid object and anything it has collision events with. In this game, and most fan games, the kid has collision events with blocks, player killers, and warps. These will be checked in the order the objects were created in the project file, the object order or collision order as it's commonly known. Usually it's blocks first, then warps, then finally player killers. When GameMaker finds that there has been a collision between the player and another object, what it does next depends on whether that object is solid or not. If it's not solid, like a warp for example, the game just runs the collision event and that's it. If the object is solid, like a block, then it does something a little more complex. Firstly, it will move the kid back to his previous position before his X and Y got updated for this frame, then it will run the collision event. Fangame engines take advantage of this by moving the kid down 1 pixel at a time in that collision event, so as to snap the kid to the edge of the block, then it will set his falling speed to 0. Considering a case like this, you can see why object ordering is important. When the player falls onto these two objects, he will briefly be inside both of them. The block has priority over the spike though, so the kid will get moved back outside the objects and then snap himself to the edge of the block without entering it. Only after that will the engine check for collision between player and spike, and it will see that there isn't one. If the objects were ordered incorrectly, the spike would take priority over the block and the kid would instead die by trying to stand here. Let's go back to the Maze 2 screen and take a look at what happens when the kid touches the exit warp. The collision event runs, and the code inside the collision event is essentially this. This is a fairly common piece of code. Set the kid's position to the start of Emperor 1, and go to Emperor 1. That's fine. But there is actually a quirk to what this code does. You see, this part, the part which updates the kid's position, happens instantly. The kid's X and Y immediately change as soon as the engine runs this line of code. This part, however, the room change, is not instantaneous. It does not immediately unload any of Maze 2 or load any of Emperor 1. All this actually does is set a flag in the engine, after which the engine will finish what it was doing, in this case checking for collisions, and then notice that it's supposed to stop executing this frame and load a different room. So now we are in this situation, where the kid has been moved inside a solid object before the room has been unloaded and during the collision checks for this frame. Ah, but hold on, this shouldn't be a problem, right? because earlier we said that blocks come before warps in the usual collision order, so GameMaker has already checked for this collision on this frame, and it won't check again, right? Well, unfortunately that's not the case here, because this actually isn't a block. It's a special type of object created just for this room called ObjMazeDisBlock. As you can see, it's solid and inherits all its behavior from the block object. The only difference is that it's later in the object order, which means this collision will be checked after touching the warp and before unloading Maze 2. And when GameMaker finds that there's been a collision with a solid object such as this one, what's the first thing it does? That's right, it returns the player to his previous position before his X and Y got updated. That's up here. And of course, when GameMaker is done checking for collisions, the very next thing it does is unload Maze 2 and load Emperor 1. As we saw earlier, the exit warp for Emperor 1 occupies the exact same area as the one for Maze 2, and the kid has just been returned to that area. So on the very next frame, the kid is going to touch the Emperor 1 exit warp and be taken to Emperor 2. Now of course, when Kamilia was testing his game, he did notice that an entire screen had gone missing. He was exiting Maze 2 and being taken to Emperor 2, and understandably, he didn't know why. He presumably did some testing and found out that the kid was touching the Emperor 1 exit warp for some reason, because his solution to the problem was to add this piece of code to the exit warp. It says, if the kid touches this warp within one frame after it spawns, don't go to Emperor 2. Instead, teleport the player to the start of the room. This seemed like a good enough solution for Kamilia, but it isn't perfect. If a player enters the Maze 2 warp by holding right, then they hold left on the next frame, they'll avoid a collision with the exit warp. This check will not happen, and the player will remain in the top right. The player is then free to enter the warp at any time to go to Emperor 2. So that's the Emperor 1 skip, a simple case of pressing left on the correct frame to avoid being teleported to the start of the room. I still occasionally see speedrunners jump up and down while trying to get this skip, as if they're trying to interact with the ceiling during the room transition. I suspect this is because of this clip of Lifted Tech recreating the skip for the first time, in which he tries and fails it a few times, then succeeds at it by jumping at the warp, so I can see why people thought the jumping was relevant. This is still how some people have learned the trick, and that's fine of course, but just to clarify, all you need to do is move left at the correct time. The jumping doesn't make a difference. I also note that Lifted Tech accidentally took this align before succeeding, and most runners do this as well. I'm not sure if this is because they believe it helps, or just because they want a consistent visual cue. It definitely makes sense that you would want to make sure your visual cue for standing in the correct spot doesn't change between runs, but other than that, your align also does not make a difference for this skip. So there it is, a full explanation of the Emperor 1 skip. If you have any questions for me, feel free to leave a comment, otherwise thank you for watching, and have a great day.